Welcome back to Wake Up with Nubian Tigers Talk, a podcast brought to you by a group of Black Princetonians where we talk about issues that impact our Black communities. With me today is my co-host, as always, Ray Small. So, Ray, what do we have for our listeners today?
You know, Michelle, we've been talking about trying to do an episode with Black veterans. And with so much going on between the wars that have ended and the wars that are about to begin, and then also the war within our own country, within our own walls. You know, we really wanted to get a perspective of Black veterans and how they saw everything that's happening today.
So today we're fortunate to have two Princeton alumni with us who are veterans. And they're going to be talking about being in the armed services from the perspective of Black officers.
So, Michelle, Commander David Steigman, he graduated Princeton with a degree in history in 1975, your class. After a period of time in the private sector as a writer, editor, and analyst, he received his commission from Officer Candidate School in March of 1981. He was a gunnery officer and a combat information officer aboard a frigate, making several deployments to the Mediterranean Sea and the North Atlantic, before he moved over to the reserves in 1984. David was also an analyst on a major defense-wide policy review, as well as a defense-wide personnel system. He also holds a graduate degree in national security studies from the U.S. Naval War College in 1992.
Impressive. Our other guest is Dr. Alicia Brooks Christie, class of 1977. She's an Army veteran and the Deputy Director of Reproductive Health and Women's Health Services in the Veterans Administration. Prior to joining the VA, she was a reproductive endocrinologist and clinical investigator at the National Institute for Health. While on active duty, Dr. Christie was chairman of the Department of Obstetrics and Gynecology at Walter Reed and retired at the rank of colonel. She holds the rank of professor at the Uniformed Services University of Health Sciences and is an adjunct professor at Howard University School of Medicine. Dr. Christie was the 2020 winner of the American Society of Reproductive Medicine Humanism in Medicine Award. In 2021, she received a Mentor of the Year Award from the American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists.
All right. Well, we want to thank David and Alicia for being here. We've been talking about doing this episode for some time, and it's come to fruition. So we look forward to it. And you know, a question for both of you guys to begin: Black people have a long and distinguished history with the United States Armed Services, stretching all the way back to the beginnings of our foundation as a nation. What motivated each of you to join your branch of service? And Alicia, we'll start with you.
Well, mine was actually purely mercenary. They paid for medical school and they paid all the fees, the tuition, and I got a stipend as well. And at the time, most of my medical school class were more than $100,000 in debt. And my mother was a widowed school teacher. And so for that reason, I joined the military. And it was not that long after Vietnam, so I was very conflicted about it. And the reason I joined the Army as opposed to the Air Force and the Navy is because I missed the deadlines for the Air Force and the Navy.
I had thought of joining the Navy when I was in college, going to OCS. My father was Navy. My mother's father and uncle were merchant marine, British and U.S. merchant marine. My parents were none too thrilled with the idea. Post-Vietnam, we don't want our son dying overseas, plus all the stories of prejudice in the Navy. I went to work for 4 years in publishing in New York and had some ups and downs, laid off in the budget crunch of 79. At that time, I decided I'm going in. It was always Navy or Coast Guard. I wanted to go to sea.
And did your father have a lot of influence on you in that regard?
The interesting thing is my parents each went back and forth, whether it was my grandfather, who died when I was 8 and was a major influence on me, or my father. Dad always had me watching Victory at Sea, the NBC documentary from the 50s. He idolized the Navy, but I think it's because it got him away from a domineering older brother and older sister for 4 years.
My father was in the dental corps in the Army for 4 years around the Korean War. And when I was commissioned, I wore his captain's bars. And when he was stationed at Fort Dix, at that time, they had segregated housing. So my father bought a trailer, bought a motorhome rather than to be in segregated housing.
Wow. Wow.
Wow.
That's
Wow.
amazing. That's
Amazing.
Well,
Yeah.
so Alicia, I'll question to you now to kind of go into your personal career. You were originally part of the Army Medical Corps, correct? So when you began your service career, can you do us and our listeners a favor and paint a picture of what it was like for you early on as a woman and also as a Black woman in the Army?
Well, I not infrequently got the question, what is it like to be the only African-American? What is it like to be the only woman or to be the only African-American woman? And what I would tell people is when you're a white male, you're presumed to be competent until you prove yourself incompetent. When you're a woman of color, you're presumed to be incompetent until you prove yourself competent. And those are very different starting places. So there was always sort of an unsaid, because I didn't experience overt racism, but there was always kind of an unsaid, you know, you're taking a spot from a white man who's more qualified. And early in my career, what I would get from, for instance, male patients is they would call me Miss instead of doctor, or they would assume that I was the nurse. And I had one patient who was running down the hall after me and he said, Miss, I need a prescription. I said, well, that's going to be a problem for you because doctors write prescriptions. And so he never called me Miss again after that.
It's always about drugs, isn't it?
True.
They need the drugs. They'll call you by your name, right?
Yeah, and even later in my career, when I was a colonel, I got asked to be on promotion boards not infrequently because they had to have diversity. And so I checked two boxes. I was Black and I was a woman. And so the major, now keep in mind, I was a colonel at the time, the major who was coordinating the promotion board went around the room and talked about why the people were there and gave the credentials of the white men. And when he got to me, he said, and Colonel Christie is here because she's a Black woman. And I said, let me tell you why I'm here. And I had to remind him about my credentials. And his face was red and he was apologetic. And, oh, I mentioned that because we have to have diversity on the promotion boards. But it was often a matter of you were assumed to be less capable and less competent than your white colleagues.
Right. And as if they couldn't tell you were the diverse person on the board by looking at you. Right. And that's a story that, we frequently hear across the board, no matter whom we've had on the show, no matter what profession they're in, this struggle with the presumption that you're not competent. And so you don't start at an even space, you start below the bar and have to climb your way up. So it's sad to hear that that's repeated also in the services, but not surprising, right? So today you specialize in women's health and reproductive services, and you've been at the VA. Can you give us a sense of the health problems our women veterans might be experiencing?
Well, women that are enrolled in VA, they tend to be sicker. They tend to have service-related conditions compared to the general population. And there's also a lot of mental health comorbidities. So about 2/3 of women that are getting care in the VA, women veterans that are enrolled in VA, have a mental health diagnosis, most of it being PTSD or depression or anxiety. And so that obviously affects other things like pregnancy or other medical conditions that they might have. Women of color are also overrepresented in both the DOD, in the military, and the VA. And so about 30% of women veterans enrolled in VA are African American.
And Alicia, what does DOD stand for those in our audience that don't know?
Department of Defense, and it's essentially the military. And so I've gotten used to using acronyms, but I'll make an effort to say military instead of DOD, because I understand many in the audience may not be familiar with that acronym. And women of color are overrepresented in the military as well. And so Blacks are about 19% in the military. So women of color are overrepresented, but not to the same degree that they are in the VA. And so all women veterans don't get care in the VA. And so people that are enrolled in the VA, they have various different categories. And so you're more likely to be eligible for care in the VA if you have service-related conditions, particularly if there's significant disability associated with that.
So this is now the third show actually where we've been talking about the mental health problems that some of Black women have across a number of different sectors. So it's interesting that is a consistent factor that we're looking at in terms of the Black female population in the United States, that our mental health and continues to be a factor given the conditions that we're living on. I'm gonna skip to a question and come back to the Tailhook scandal in a minute, but I saw you in the congressional hearings when you were talking about reproductive health services for veterans. And the hearing was talking about a number of issues, which I have to admit, I wasn't familiar with any of these, but it had to do with infertility issues and having veterans get access to that. And a lot of the questions from one of the senators was about male veterans who are paralyzed as a result of IEDs or what have you. And it made me think for a minute that I didn't ever remember seeing a Black female vet in a wheelchair. But I know that there have to be some Black female vets who have been incapacitated at that level. And I'm wondering if you could share with us what their experiences are, particularly in the reproductive context, and one, why we don't see them, and two, are they getting assistance with their needs to help create families and do what people who are not disabled can do?
Well, there's a very large prosthetics office, and so there are a number of veterans who get care in the VA that are disabled with missing limbs, some of them in wheelchairs. And the reason in Congress that they focus so much on the spinal cord injuries, because that's an easy service-connected condition to make an argument that it affects their fertility. Usually with women, if they have a significant abdominal injury, then that would result in hysterectomy. And so they're less likely to maintain reproductive function with similar sorts of injuries. But there is an organization, Paralyzed Veterans of America, and there are other veteran support organizations for veterans who have those particular disabilities. And women veterans, unfortunately, overall, and particularly women veterans of color, are often underrepresented in the ads and in the news stories. And when people think of veterans, they often think of men. And in fact, I get my medical care at Walter Reed, and people will still call my husband Colonel Christie. You know, they'll assume he's the one that had served in the military. And so that has a lot to do with it. And the other thing I think is people tend to relate to people who are similar to them. And so a congressman who happens to be a white male relates to a white male service member who has been injured and is in a wheelchair as a result of that. And so I think they tend to be much more visible. And so it's not that there aren't disabled women veterans, particularly disabled women veterans of color. It's just that they aren't as visible. In my office, what we're doing is we're partnering with a number of different offices to make sure that women with spinal cord injuries get appropriate reproductive health care, and that all the clinics have the appropriate facilities to serve these women. So we're working with the spinal cord injury office, with comprehensive health, and with reproductive health in order to do that. One of the other things that we're doing in that space is we're also partnering with subject matter experts about sexual function and fertility issues in women with spinal cord injuries.
Yeah, it was interesting. I think what you say is right about the senators, because the ones I saw who were mostly male and mostly white just seemed to have difficulty contemplating women's body parts and the sexual needs that women might have. And most of the questions devolves back to men, even though it was a committee about, anyway. So that was an interesting experience for me to see you in that role. So let me get back to where I was going before. And that is that in the 1991 Tailhook scandal, it was revealed that the degree of sexual assault and violence against women in the service was much more prevalent than people thought. And over the past year, there have been many stories about violence against women of color who are serving, including sexual assaults and homicides. Can you tell us how prevalent that violence is, and what, if anything, how has it manifested as far as your experience? And if you know, what are the services doing about that?
Well, let me start first with the VA, because in the VA, there's mandatory universal screening for military sexual trauma. And so that's sexual assault and sexual harassment. And so 1 in 3 women veterans that are getting care in the VA have a positive screen for military sexual trauma, or MST.
Say that, I'm sorry. Say that again, Alicia. How
yes,
many?
It's 1 in 3, but it includes not just sexual assault, but also sexual harassment. And these are women that are getting care in the VA. And in fact, if you aren't otherwise eligible to get care in the VA, but you've experienced military sexual trauma, you can get medical care related to that. So for instance, counseling. Or if, say, you had an orthopedic injury during a sexual assault, you could get care for that. So medical care related to the military sexual trauma. And so 1 in 3 have a positive screen. So they ask them 2 questions. One has to deal with sexual harassment, and the other one has to deal with sexual assault. So answering in the positive to either of them is a positive screen, and it's 1 in 3 women, 1 in 50 men. And so there are more men who've experienced military sexual trauma just because there are so many more men in the military and in the VA. And of the veterans who screen positive for military sexual trauma, 16% of them are African-American women. Mm. And so they're actually somewhat underrepresented on the positive screens, but one of the problem with any of those sorts of screens is that you don't know who is reticent to answer in the positive, and it also doesn't tell you who needed or sought care. But it's 1 in 3 for women, veterans getting care in the VA, and 1 in 50 men.
So you also shared with us some information about Black female vets who have actually been killed while on duty. So maybe you can.
Yes, and Ray provided, actually, I had difficulty finding, there was actually a documentary about PFC Johnson, who was actually killed in Iraq, and the circumstances surrounding her death and the autopsy were inconsistent with a suicide. And the case was closed and ruled a suicide, but her father, who's a psychologist who actually worked as a civilian with the military for a number of years, continued the investigation, and, you know, hired a pathologist, et cetera. And I don't have the link for the documentary. Ray
We'll provide
can,
it.
okay, Ray
We'll
can
provide it
provide
to
that.
you. Yeah.
And so there was that case, and there was another case of a young enlisted Black woman, and she was stabbed to death. And they accepted her white colleague's explanation of they were fooling around with a knife. And he was dishonorably discharged, and I believe he got 18 months. So one of the big problems, I think, is the lack of equity and consequences. And so Ray and I were talking about the recent case of the young Hispanic woman who was killed at Fort Hood.
Right.
And so I believe somewhere between 14 and 16 people were disciplined at Fort Hood. And so I was saying to Ray, and I said, you know, well, perhaps that's a start. And he pointed out, well, what was the discipline? So if it's a negative letter in your file that disappears after 2 years, that certainly isn't consistent with the level of the offense. And so I think in general, that's a big problem with all of these things, is that there aren't consequences. And I don't want to misquote this attorney, but it was an Air Force attorney who spoke at a military sexual trauma conference, and nearly 50% of women who report military sexual trauma experience some retaliation. And only 3% of their attackers are actually prosecuted and sentenced. And so you can see what a disincentive it is to report with those kinds of statistics.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, so I want to bring David in because the question that Michelle just asked of Alicia regarding the Tailhook scandal. So David, you were in intelligence at that time when that took place, or tell me a little bit more about your understanding of the scandal and how your part of your branch of the service interacted with the Navy at that point.
I was a line officer in the surface and unrestricted lines, so Tailhook was entirely naval aviators. My connection was I was the lead reporter for Navy Times, which is part of the Army Times, Navy Times Defense News. And as the lead reporter, one of the things that struck me was the first two names that the Naval Investigative Service, the predecessor to NCIS, which is so widely seen on TV. And NIS's investigation, out of all the people in the gauntlet, the rows of men, a Black male Marine and an Australian officer. These were all they picked up. And when they showed the pictures to Paula Coughlin, the Navy lieutenant who was the instigator of the complaint, she was uncertain. When it reached Navy senior leadership and Marine Corps senior leadership, it was and I had a couple of good sources because the commanding officer, my second commanding officer, who I'd follow him to the ends of the earth, and he's been a good mentor to me, was one of those that the view was, wait, this is unsat. This, NIS, go back and do your job. When the cases were referred to Commandant Marine Corps for adjudication, he took note that practically the entire squadron roster for Major Bonham, the Black Marine, said, oh, he wasn't there near the gauntlet at the time. He was with us partying in a suite in a different part of the hotel. Well, Commandant Marine Corps is faced with NIS, which already after the Battleship Iowa, there were questions of, well, these guys are genuine, hard-charging police force, and with an entire squadron saying, no, we weren't near there and we can get you plenty of witnesses. Commandant Marine Corps decided to withdraw all charges as requested by NIS.
David, how unusual is that? Does that happen a lot? Does it happen only on rare occasions? I mean, from your standpoint?
That NIS would do this poor a job didn't surprise me. Note that within the past 5 years, NIS had botched the investigation of the Walker spies and the battleship Iowa. That one officer would be charged like this, part of it is surprising. And I say part of it because there were enough other officers there that it should have been very, very easy. And also saying, it was when they really began pushing, because all they initially tried to say was a foreign officer, and it was when they pushed that they figured it was probably an English-speaking officer, which narrowed it down to Canada, the UK, and Australia. 5 other officers were the key focus of the investigation. Discipline hit. They did a shabby job. As far as me as a reservist, the only way it hit was every officer had to sign a statement that they hadn't been nowhere near the events in Las Vegas.
Mm-hmm. Well, so David, you just mentioned that black officer, or that black naval officer, was not. They had to drop charges against him. But in a recent article published in 2020, black officers and enlisted people criticized the Armed Services report on disparate rates of discipline that were racially driven, with black soldiers being disciplined more frequently and more severely than whites. I mean, no difference between the military services and regular society. So did you see any evidence of fellow officers finding more fault with their black enlisted
Yes,
members?
Yes, I did. Some of the officers, it was a case of genuine racial prejudice. I can think of one officer on our ship who wrote a guy up for missing the end of his leave, his vacation. Well, there was a snowstorm in Buffalo. The only case of the 2 times where there were racial complaints on the ship I was on, one of them was because an officer who was Naval Academy, who's a friend of mine, came on, and he basically slammed 6 people, 5 white and 1 black in his division. Some of the Academy guys can be very gung-ho. And the previous officer had been one of these pull with an easy oar, so to speak. So that one, when it turned out to be 6 enlisted getting slammed and only 1 was black, the view was Mr. Hancock just needs to adjust his view towards his entire division. Otherwise, I can think of a few other cases on the ship I was on where non-judicial punishment. Oh, and in my last 2 months, I was on separation boards. That's where you have 3 or 4 officers judging whether junior enlisted with drug offenses should be retained in the service or pushed out. And it struck me that minorities were much more likely to be hammered than white enlisted.
So that's the first part of our episode with Colonel Dr. Alicia Christie, Princeton class of 77, and Commander David Steidman, class of 75. So stay tuned for the conclusion of the discussion with them in our next episode.
If you enjoyed what you heard today, visit our website, nubiantigerspodcast.com. In addition to the podcast, we also post a resource page for each subject to provide additional sources of information. Follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @NubianTigers, written as one word. We're also on YouTube on the Nubian Tigers podcast channel. Our podcast is hosted by Anchor FM, but if you have a favorite podcast app, we're probably on it. Just look for the Nubian Tigers Talk. Looking forward to sharing some knowledge with you next time.
Wake up, wake up, wake up.